The morning sun cast long shadows across the eastern pasture as I stepped onto the porch of our family ranch house, coffee mug in hand. The steam rose from the cup, mingling with the cool morning air as I surveyed the land that had been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather purchased these 300 acres in 1932, during the worst of the Great Depression, when everyone thought he was crazy for buying so much land when people could barely afford food. But he had vision, and that vision had sustained our family through nearly a century of changing times. I took a deep breath, savoring the earthy scent of fresh-cut hay and distant pine forest. This place was more than property to me. It was living history. Every fence post had a story. Every weathered barn board connected me to my ancestors who had worked this same land, watched the same distant mountains, and cherished the same sense of freedom that comes with wide-open spaces. The main house, a sturdy 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, had been expanded and renovated over the decades but still maintained its original character. Inside, photographs lined the walls showing each generation that had called this place home. My typical day started early before sunrise. There were always animals to tend to, fences to mend, and endless maintenance that comes with rural living. We were not a commercial ranch anymore, not like in my grandfather's day when they ran hundreds of cattle. Now we kept just enough livestock to maintain our agricultural status, plus my small collection of rescue horses. I worked a regular job in town, but the ranch remained my true passion and purpose. Walking along the eastern property line, I noticed new construction in the adjacent subdivision. 5 years ago, this had all been undeveloped farmland owned by the Johnsons. When they sold to developers, I knew change was coming, but nothing prepared me for how quickly the rural landscape transformed. What started as a few model homes had exploded into a full-fledged planned community with identical houses, manicured lawns, and strict community guidelines. The Meadow Creek Estates, they called it, complete with a homeowners association that regulated everything from mailbox designs to lawn ornaments. It was a different world from our weathered barns and practical outbuildings, but initially, relations had been cordial. Some new residents even seemed fascinated by the ranch, stopping to admire the horses or wave as they took evening walks along the road that separated our properties. I had welcomed several newcomers, bringing them fresh eggs or offering advice about the local area. Most seemed to appreciate having a piece of authentic country living next door, even if they preferred their own carefully controlled version of suburban convenience. The contrast between our properties was stark, but not necessarily confrontational. My weathered fence posts and open pastures stood opposite their uniform stucco walls and geometric landscaping. The first hint of confusion came about 6 months after the initial homes were completed. A young couple building a house near our shared boundary asked if they could extend their backyard by a few feet onto unused ranch land. I politely explained the property lines and showed them the survey markers, not thinking much of it at the time. They seemed to understand, and we parted on friendly terms. What I did not realize then was that the developer had been somewhat creative with how they presented the community layout to new buyers. The glossy brochures and site maps showed generous lots extending right up to what they vaguely called green space, without clearly indicating where HOA land ended and my ranch began. This misrepresentation would later prove to be the seed of much bigger problems, though at the time, I had no idea what was coming. The first official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in April. I sorted through my mail at the kitchen table, separating bills from advertisements, when I came across an official-looking envelope with Meadow Creek ESTATS HOA printed in bold letters across the top. Curious, I opened it and pulled out a form letter headed with Notice of Violation. The letter stated that unmaintained structures on my property were in violation of community standards and needed to be addressed within 14 days to avoid further action. I read the notice twice, convinced there must be some mistake. The letter referenced Community Bylaws Section 8.3 and specifically mentioned my equipment shed that stood about 50 yards from our shared boundary. The shed had been there for over 30 years. More importantly, it was on my ranch property, completely outside HOA jurisdiction. Why would they send me a violation notice for property they had no authority over? Assuming it was a simple misunderstanding, I called the number listed on the letterhead. After navigating an automated system, I reached a woman who identified herself as Susan Parker, the Meadow Creek HOA president. Her voice was clipped and professional as I explained the situation. "Mrs. Parker, I received a violation notice about a structure on my ranch, but there must be some confusion. My property is not part of your homeowners association." There was a pause before she responded. "According to our community maps, that shed encroaches on the green space buffer zone that belongs to Meadow Creek. All structures in that area must meet community standards." Her certainty caught me off guard. There must be a misunderstanding about the property lines. My family has owned this land for generations, and that shed has been there for decades. "Well, the development plans clearly show that area as part of our community space," she countered. "I can send you a copy of our approved plans if you would like." We went back and forth for several minutes, neither of us giving ground. Eventually, I suggested we meet in person to look at the actual property markers. She agreed, though not enthusiastically, and we scheduled a time for the following afternoon. When Susan Parker arrived at the appointed time, I understood immediately why residents referred to her as Karen behind her back. She pulled up in a luxury SUV, stepped out in pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt with the Meadow Creek logo embroidered on the chest. Her blonde hair was cut in a perfect bob, not a strand out of place despite the breeze. She carried a clipboard and wore an expression that suggested she was accustomed to getting her way. I led her to the property line where survey stakes marked the boundary. "These are the official markers from when the property was surveyed last year, before the development was finished. As you can see, my shed is a good 50 feet inside my property line." Karen glanced at the markers dismissively. "These do not match our community plans." The developer assured the board that this entire section was included in our green space easement. I maintained my patience. "Then your developer made a mistake. These are the legal boundaries. I have the survey documents if you would like to see them." She made a show of taking photographs of the shed and the property line with her phone. "I will have to bring this to the attention of our board. In the meantime, the violation notice stands." As she turned to leave, I called after her. "Mrs. Parker, please understand that your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property. I am not a member of your association, and I am not bound by your rules." She looked back with a tight smile. "Everyone in this area is expected to maintain certain standards, Mr. Johnson. We will be in touch." Over the next few weeks, more notices appeared, each citing different violations. My tractor parked outside instead of in a garage. A hay bale stack visible from the road. Even the rescue horses in the front pasture described as livestock inappropriately housed in a residential zone. Each notice was more strongly worded than the last, with increasing mentions of fines and potential legal action. I began finding these notices tucked into my fence posts or attached to outbuildings, meaning someone, presumably Karen, was physically coming onto my property to deliver them. Once, I spotted her from the barn, standing near my equipment shed, taking photographs while talking on her phone. When she saw me approaching, she quickly returned to the subdivision side of the boundary. That evening, as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant orange and purple, I spread out old property deeds, recent surveys, and county maps across my dining room table. The boundaries were clear and undisputed in every official document. This was my land, just as it had been my father's land and his father's before him. Yet something told me this dispute was just beginning, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. By early summer, it became clear that Karen was not simply confused about property lines. She had launched a deliberate campaign against the ranch. From my kitchen window one Saturday morning, I watched a group of HOA residents gathered at the boundary, with Karen at the center, gesturing toward my barn and speaking animatedly. I could not hear what she was saying, but her body language told the story. She was rallying neighbors against the ranch. The following week, I received a copy of the Meadow Creek community newsletter from a sympathetic neighbor who had moved in from another rural area and understood the mounting tension. Inside was an article titled "Maintaining Community Standards, Addressing External Challenges." Though it never mentioned my ranch by name, the implications were clear. Unsightly neighboring properties threaten home values, and the board is actively addressing boundary encroachments from adjacent non-conforming land use. Word traveled quickly in our small town. While shopping for supplies, I overheard conversations about how that old ranch is causing problems for the new subdivision. When questioned, people cited complaints about everything from animal smells to equipment noise, normal aspects of rural living that had never been issues before. Karen was systematically turning public opinion against the ranch through a whisper campaign of misinformation. The confrontations became more direct and frequent. One afternoon, while repairing a fence, I looked up to see Karen approaching with two men in polo shirts who she introduced as fellow board members. "We need to discuss the equipment you have parked along our community border," she announced without greeting. "It violates our sight line regulations and is visible from multiple homes." I straightened up, setting my tools aside. "As I have explained multiple times, Mrs. Parker, your regulations do not apply to my property. This ranch is not part of your HOA." The taller of the two men stepped forward. "Perhaps you do not understand the impact your operation has on our community values. Homes along this border are selling for 20% less than comparable properties elsewhere in the development." "That is not my concern," I replied firmly. "This was a working ranch long before your development existed. Anyone who bought property here knew they were moving next to agricultural land." Karen's voice rose an octave. The developer assured buyers that this area would conform to community standards. "That equipment has been in the same spot for months. It needs to be moved immediately, or we will take further action." "That tractor has been parked in the same spot for 15 years, I countered. "And what exactly do you mean by further action?" Karen's face flushed with indignation. "The HOA bylaws allow for fines of up to $500 per day for unresolved violations. We can also pursue legal remedies for properties that persistently impact community standards, even external ones." I took a deep breath, maintaining my composure despite my rising anger. "I suggest you consult with an attorney before making threats. You have no legal authority over this property." The conversation ended with Karen pointing her finger at me. "We will see about that. Expect to hear from our legal team." After they left, I walked the property line, something bothering me about their increasingly aggressive approach. Near the southwest corner, I noticed something I had overlooked: a small security camera I had installed the previous year after some minor vandalism incidents. It was aimed at a storage shed, but also captured part of the property boundary. That evening, I reviewed weeks of footage. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions. The camera had captured Karen entering my property at least 7 times, placing notices on buildings, taking photographs of equipment, and once even measuring the distance from my tractor to the property line. She was repeatedly and deliberately trespassing. With this evidence in hand, I contacted my family attorney, a man who had handled our affairs for decades. He reviewed the footage, property documents, and collection of violation notices with growing concern. "This is clear harassment," he concluded, "and multiple instances of trespassing. I recommend we send a formal cease and desist letter to both Mrs. Parker personally and the HOA board." The letter was drafted in firm but professional language, outlining the legal boundaries of my property, documenting the pattern of harassment, providing evidence of trespassing, and demanding all communication cease except through proper legal channels. It concluded with a clear statement that any further trespassing would result in criminal charges being filed. The response was swift and explosive. The very afternoon the letters were delivered, Karen appeared at the property line, her face contorted with rage. I was working in the garden and saw her storming across the subdivision's common area toward the boundary. "How dare you threaten me with legal action?" she shouted across the fence. "I am performing my duties as HOA president. Your property is dragging down our entire community." I approached the fence calmly. "Mrs. Parker, all communication needs to go through our attorneys now. Please do not come onto my property again." "You cannot hide behind lawyers," she spat. "The board has unanimously voted to pursue all available remedies against your violations. We have the resources of 96 homeowners behind us. You are one person with an outdated property that does not belong here anymore." As she turned to leave, she delivered a final threat. "By the time we are done, you will either conform to our standards or wish you had sold this worthless land when you had the chance." Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as I watched her retreat, a fitting metaphor for the storm that was brewing between us. This was no longer about property aesthetics or community standards. It had become a battle for the very existence of my family's legacy. The morning that changed everything dawned clear and warm. I started early, taking advantage of the pleasant weather to repair a section of fence along the eastern boundary, close to where our property met the Meadow Creek common area. The wooden posts had begun to rot at the base, a common problem in our soil, and needed replacement before they failed completely. I had my truck parked nearby, tools spread out on a tarp, and had already dug out 2 old posts. The work was peaceful, almost meditative. The rhythmic swing of the post hole digger, the satisfying progress of each completed section. Birds called from nearby trees, and the scent of fresh earth filled the air. These quiet moments of connection with the land were why I could never imagine living anywhere else, despite the increasing pressures from the development next door. I was setting a new cedar post when movement caught my eye. Karen was walking purposefully along the common area path, phone already in hand. She wore her usual Meadow Creek polo shirt and khaki pants, an unofficial uniform that seemed to reinforce her sense of authority. From her determined stride and fixed expression, I knew this would not be a friendly encounter. She stopped about 10 feet from where I was working, just on her side of the property line. "You need to remove your equipment from community property immediately," she announced without preamble, her voice sharp enough to carry across the distance between us. I straightened slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Parker. As you can see, I am working on my fence on my property." She gestured dismissively at the boundary. This entire area is designated community space according to our plans. You are trespassing and destroying HOA landscaping." The absurdity of her claim momentarily left me speechless. I was standing next to a fence post that had stood in the same spot for decades, at least 20 feet inside my property line. "Mrs. Parker, we have been through this multiple times. These are the legal property boundaries. Your developer may have shown you something different, but these markers are the official survey points." I pointed to a metal stake with an orange cap that had been placed by the county surveyor the previous year. Karen crossed her arms. "Those were moved. Our community plat shows this area extending at least 30 feet beyond this point. Survey markers are not something people just move around," I explained, trying to maintain patience. "They are registered with the county. Moving them would be a serious crime." "I do not appreciate your condescending tone," she snapped. "The fact remains you are working on Meadow Creek property without authorization. I am asking you one final time to remove your equipment and vacate community land." I took a deep breath. "This is not your property. I am not leaving. If you have concerns about the boundaries, I suggest you consult with a surveyor or an attorney." Karen's expression hardened. She held up her phone. "Then you leave me no choice." She tapped the screen deliberately and put the phone to her ear, never breaking eye contact with me. A moment later, she spoke clearly into the phone. "Yes, I need to report a trespasser who refuses to leave community property." She paused, listening. "Meadow Creek Estates on the eastern boundary path. There is a man with tools and equipment who has damaged community property and refuses to leave when asked." Another pause. "No, I have not been threatened, but he is being confrontational, and I do not feel safe." I stood dumbfounded as she continued to describe me as an aggressive trespasser to the 911 dispatcher. The deliberate mischaracterization was breathtaking. When she mentioned potential weapons, referring to my ordinary fence repair tools, I nearly interrupted her, but instinct told me to remain calm and let this play out. After ending the call, Karen gave me a tight smile. "The police will sort this out. I suggest you start packing up." "You just filed a false police report," I said quietly. "This is my property. The police will confirm that." "We will see whom they believe," she replied with unnerving confidence. For the next 30 minutes, I continued working, though my earlier peace was shattered. Karen remained standing at the boundary, occasionally taking photos or making notes, maintaining her self-appointed vigil. The surreal standoff continued until the crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of a police cruiser down my ranch road. Officer Dave Miller stepped out, followed by his younger partner. I had known Dave for years. His father had been friends with mine, and he had grown up in the area. He approached with a professional expression, though I caught the slight furrow in his brow as he assessed the situation. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," he greeted me. "Got a call about a property dispute." Karen immediately stepped forward. "Officer, this man is trespassing on Meadow Creek Estates property and refused to leave when instructed. He has damaged community landscaping with his equipment." Officer Miller turned to her. "And you are?" "Susan Parker, president of the Meadow Creek Homeowners Association. This entire area is designated community space according to our development plans." Dave nodded calmly. "I understand. Do you have documentation of these property boundaries with you?" Karen fumbled with her phone. "I can pull up the community plat map, but it is on file with the county as well." While she searched for the document, Officer Miller walked over to where I stood. "What is your understanding of the situation, sir?" I gestured to the survey marker. "This is my property, Dave. has been in my family for nearly a century. That marker was placed by the county surveyor last year. I am simply repairing fence posts that have been in the same location for decades." The younger officer had walked to the survey marker and was examining it. "This appears to be an official county marker, sir." Dave nodded. "Mrs. Parker, these survey markers establish the legal property line. From what I can see, Mr. Johnson is well within his own property." Karen's face flushed. "That cannot be right. Our development plans show." "Development plans do not override legal surveys," Dave interrupted gently. "If there is a discrepancy, you would need to address that with your developer or pursue a proper boundary dispute through civil court. But as it stands, no trespassing is occurring here." "But he is using heavy equipment visible from our community path," Karen protested, her voice rising. "That violates our HOA guidelines for the green space buffer." Officer Miller's expression remained professional, but his voice took on a firmer tone. "Mrs. Parker, your HOA guidelines only apply to properties within your association. Mr. Johnson's ranch is not part of your HOA, and you have no authority to enforce your rules on his land." The realization that the police were not going to support her position visibly shook Karen's confidence. Her mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find a compelling argument. "Furthermore," Dave continued, "making false reports to emergency services is a serious matter. In the future, boundary disputes should be handled through proper legal channels, not by calling 911. As the officers prepared to leave, Dave gave me a subtle nod of acknowledgement. "Sorry for the interruption to your morning, Mr. Johnson. You are free to continue your work." I watched as Karen stood rigid with humiliation as the police departed. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly back toward the subdivision, her back straight and her steps measured. But this was far from over. The public confrontation had only raised the stakes in our ongoing battle. The police cruiser disappeared down my driveway, leaving a cloud of dust that slowly settled in the late morning sun. Karen had retreated to the subdivision, her rigid posture betraying her humiliation and anger. I stood by my half-finished fence repair, the tools suddenly heavy in my hands as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade. Officer Miller had pulled me aside before leaving. "You might want to document everything going forward," he advised quietly. "This type of situation rarely resolves itself after one interaction. Start keeping records of every encounter, every communication." His words stayed with me as I finished setting the new fence post. That evening, I cleared my dining room table and began what would become a comprehensive investigation. I spread out all the violation notices I had received, organizing them chronologically. The progression was telling, from vague references to community standards to specific threats of financial penalties and legal action. Each document revealed Karen's escalating determination to assert control over my property. The next morning, I drove to the county record's office. The clerk, an older woman who remembered my father, helped me access all relevant documents related to both my ranch and the Meadow Creek development. The official plats confirmed what I already knew. The boundaries shown on the survey markers were correct. But something else caught my attention. The developer's original submission had included a buffer zone that partially overlapped my property. This had been corrected in the final approved plans, but I wondered if the HOA was still working from those preliminary drawings. Digging deeper, I discovered something troubling. 6 months earlier, another property owner adjacent to Meadow Creek had faced similar harassment from the HOA. The elderly man had eventually sold his small parcel to the developer at below market value rather than continue fighting. Was this a pattern, a deliberate strategy? I extended my research, visiting the public library to search through local newspaper archives. Over the past 3 years, since Meadow Creek broke ground, there had been 4 separate boundary disputes with neighboring properties. In each case, the HOA had aggressively pushed its interpretation of property lines, and in 3 of those cases, they had eventually acquired the disputed land. Back at home, I reviewed the security camera footage again. Something Karen had said during one of her trespassing incidents caught my attention. Rewinding and increasing the volume, I heard her clearly telling someone on the phone, "The southwest corner is the priority. If we can establish precedent there, the rest of the perimeter will follow." This was not random harassment. It was a calculated attempt to slowly encroach on surrounding properties, expanding the development's footprint through intimidation rather than legitimate purchase. My next step was to contact neighbors who had sold land to the development. Most were reluctant to speak, but one former owner, Mr. Grayson, invited me to visit him at his new home in town. Over coffee, he revealed that the pressure from the HOA had become unbearable. "They cited me for violations every week," he explained. "When I ignored them, they started calling the county with complaints about my property. Building inspectors, health department, animal control, they all showed up on my doorstep. It was easier to sell than fight." Armed with this context, I decided to consult with a law firm specializing in property disputes and HOA issues. The attorney I met with, Alina Simmons, reviewed my growing file of evidence with increasing interest. "What you are describing goes beyond typical boundary disagreements," she noted. "The pattern of harassment, false claims to authorities, and deliberate trespassing are serious issues." When I showed her the footage of Karen's trespassing and the documentation of similar disputes with other neighbors, Alina's expression turned grave. "There is something else you should see," I said, pulling out my final discovery. It was a copy of an email chain I had obtained from a sympathetic Meadow Creek resident who worked at the county office. In it, dated 3 months earlier, Karen acknowledged to the developer that the ranch property line is accurately marked, but we should proceed with the pressure campaign as discussed. Alina sat back in her chair. "This is significant. It proves she knowingly misrepresented the boundaries and engaged in deliberate harassment. This changes the situation from a boundary dispute to potential fraud and harassment." We spent the next hour discussing options. Alina explained that we could file a lawsuit not just against Karen personally, but against the entire HOA board for their role in the harassment campaign. "Based on the evidence you have gathered, you have grounds for claims of harassment, trespassing, abuse of process, and potentially fraud," she concluded. "The HOA's insurance would likely cover the board, but Karen's personal actions might exceed those protections." As I drove home that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows across the ranch. The familiar landscape looked unchanged, yet everything felt different. What had begun as annoying boundary confusion had revealed itself as something much more calculated. My family had defended this land through economic depression, droughts, and changing times. Now I would defend it in the courts. That night, looking at old family photographs on the living room wall, I made my decision. The time for passive responses was over. I would not be intimidated off land that had been in my family for generations. The next move would be mine, and it would change the dynamics of this conflict permanently. The stack of documents on my attorney's conference table stood nearly 8 inches tall. Violation notices, photographs, survey documents, security footage screenshots, witness statements, and historical property records. months of meticulous documentation organized into a compelling narrative of harassment and overreach. Alina had drafted a comprehensive complaint that named both Karen personally and the Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association as defendants. "Once we file this," Alina explained, "there is no turning back. Are you certain you want to proceed?" I looked at the evidence before us, thinking about all the hours spent building this case, all the stress and confrontation of the past months. "Yes," I answered firmly. "This has gone far beyond a simple misunderstanding. They need to be held accountable." Alina nodded. "The complaint alleges harassment, trespassing, abuse of process, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and slander of title. We are seeking injunctive relief to stop the harassment immediately, plus compensatory damages for the time and distress this has caused you." The next morning, I accompanied Alina to the county courthouse. The building's imposing stone facade and formal atmosphere lent gravity to the moment. As I signed the final paperwork at her direction, I felt the weight of my decision. This was not just about property lines anymore. It was about standing up against bullying and manipulation. The clerk stamped the documents and provided us with official copies. "The defendants will be served within 5 business days," he explained. "They will have 30 days to respond to the complaint." The process server delivered the lawsuit papers 3 days later. I learned the timing could not have been more dramatic. Karen was hosting the monthly HOA board meeting when the server arrived at the Meadow Creek Community Center. According to a sympathetic neighbor who was present, the server interrupted the meeting to hand Karen the documents personally. "The color drained from her face," my neighbor reported via text message. "She tried to maintain composure, but everyone could tell something serious had happened." Word spread quickly through the development. Within days, clear factions had formed among the residents. Some rallied behind Karen, echoing her claims that the ranch was lowering property values and that my lawsuit was an attack on the entire community. Others, particularly those who had moved from rural areas themselves, questioned the board's actions and expressed concerns about potential financial liability for all homeowners. The community newsletter, usually filled with garden club announcements and maintenance reminders, dedicated its entire front page to what it called legal challenges facing our community. The article carefully avoided admitting any wrongdoing while preparing residents for potential special assessments to cover legal expenses. Karen herself launched an aggressive defense campaign. She called an emergency community meeting where, according to multiple sources, she portrayed herself as a victim who was simply protecting community interests. She distributed a printed timeline that conveniently omitted her trespassing, the false police report, and the email proving her knowledge of the true boundaries. She told everyone the ranch was trying to block community expansion that had been promised by the developer. Another resident informed me. Many people seemed to believe her, but others were asking tough questions about whether she had proper authority to pursue this boundary dispute. 10 days after filing the lawsuit, I received notice that the HOA had retained Brandon Wells, a prominent local attorney known for representing developers and community associations. His reputation for aggressive litigation tactics preceded him. Alina was not intimidated. "This suggests they are taking the case seriously," she noted. "They would not bring in someone of his caliber if they thought this was a simple matter to dismiss." The first procedural hearing was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, the HOA's attorney submitted multiple requests for documents and evidence. Alina assured me this was standard procedure, but the formality of the legal notices arriving at my door kept the situation at the forefront of my mind. 3 weeks after filing, I was working in the barn when a vehicle I did not recognize pulled into my driveway. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped out, looking somewhat out of place against the rural backdrop. "Mr. Johnson, my name is Brandon Wells. I represent the Meadow Creek HOA." I regarded him cautiously. "My attorney advised me not to speak with you directly." He nodded. "That is sensible advice. I am not here to discuss the case details. I simply wanted to see the property and boundaries for myself before proceeding further. Professional courtesy suggested I introduce myself rather than just drive by." There was something in his manner, a straightforward professionalism, that contrasted sharply with Karen's combative approach. He did not ask to enter the property or attempt to engage me in substantive discussion about the case. As he turned to leave, he paused. "For what it is worth, Mr. Johnson, I believe every dispute has a resolution that can work for all parties. Sometimes it takes filing a lawsuit to bring everyone to the table in good faith." Later that day, a leaner called with interesting news. "Wells has requested a copy of the complete HOA files related to your property. My sources tell me he was not pleased to discover the email proving Karen knew about the real boundaries months ago." "What does that mean for us?" I asked. "It means the HOA's attorney is discovering that his client may not have been fully transparent with him. That often leads to settlement discussions rather than protracted litigation." As the first court date approached, a subtle shift occurred in the neighborhood dynamics. Karen was seen less frequently at the property line. The violation notices stopped appearing, and most tellingly, several board members reached out to mutual acquaintances, floating questions about what it might take to put this unfortunate situation behind us. The legal machinery, once set in motion, had changed the power dynamic completely. For the first time since the conflict began, I felt a cautious optimism that resolution might be possible. But after months of harassment and false accusations, I was determined that any resolution would require full accountability, not just a quiet retreat from their untenable position. The Meadow Creek Estates HOA board called an emergency closed session, meeting 2 days before our scheduled court appearance. I learned about it through my network of sympathetic neighbors who had grown disenchanted with Karen's leadership. According to my sources, the meeting lasted over 4 hours, voices occasionally rising loud enough to be heard through the community center's thin walls. What happened in that room would change everything. The board had received a confidential case assessment from their attorney that painted a bleak picture of their legal position. Brandon Wells had apparently been direct in his evaluation. The documentation I had gathered, particularly the email proving Karen knew the true boundaries, created significant liability, not just for the HOA, but potentially for individual board members who had supported her campaign. The following morning, I received a call from a leaner. "The HOA's attorney has requested a settlement conference," she announced. "They want to resolve this before the hearing." We met that afternoon in a leaner's office, myself and a leaner on one side of the conference table, Brandon Wells and 3 Meadow Creek board members on the other. Karen was conspicuously absent.